So we'll move on to the second talk. The second talk is by Chris Muller, Executive Vice President, Exploration K92 from K92 Mining Incorporated. He's going to talk about the Blue Lake Porphyry, a greenfields gold and copper discovery in PNG. Chris Muller is a geologist with more than 20 years' experience at open pit and underground mines, near mine, brownfields and greenfields exploration in numerous countries. Chris has been directly involved in several important mineral finds during his career, including the discovery of 3 significant gold, copper, porphyry and porphyry-related deposits, including his work at Goldpoo. So we'll hand over to Chris.
Thank you very much, Fraser. And thank you, Keith and Angelique, for the opportunity to present here at NewGenGold 2023. And thanks ever so much to Dave Burt here for unveiling the Onto Beast. I mean, wow, what an act to follow, hey? I mean, couldn't you have presented that after mine? But anyway, I do recall seeing the core at PDAC a couple of years ago in Toronto and just drooling over what I thought was bornite, to be honest, in buggy silica, but as it turns out, it was covellite, so unbelievable deposit. But in any case, I think, well, you know, Blue Lake, it's no Onto, but it is a novel discovery in Papua New Guinea. So I'm hoping that you'll find, you know, some aspects of this very recent exploration history of interest. And yeah, I mean, it is an interesting, very interesting history. There's certainly some unusual circumstances which I'll outline during this presentation. So what we're looking at here is Blue Lake. As you can see, it's actually more green, but I haven't been able to get the locals to change the name. Blue Lake deposit is behind these hills here, and the Kora deposit is hiding in the clouds in this mountain here. Down in the background there, you've got the K92 mine and infrastructure down in the lowlands. So some of you may recall that I presented the Kora North discovery here back in 2019. And that's come actually a long way since then. So I'm just going to briefly outline that before we get into Blue Lake. There's been a number of people involved in this discovery, including quite a few national geologists and in particular field technicians. So one of them I actually showed yesterday, this fella, Sonny Mori. I showed him that his name was in a publication, you know, a printed document, and he was just buzzing me all day with WhatsApp messages, just so elated. So it's really good, you know, to share all this stuff with the nationals. They really appreciate that. Oops. Seems to have frozen up on me. I am pressing the right button. Oops. Just a bit of a delay one there. I'm sure you've all read that by now. If not, don't worry, because they're all much the same, I'm pretty sure. Alrighty, so looking at Papua New Guinea, I'm sure many of you will know that Papua New Guinea is home to many of the globally significant copper-gold deposits. And I've had the fortune in 18 years working in Papua New Guinea to work on many of these, or several of the major deposits, and with several, you know, renowned delegates in this room, including Fraser here. So it's a very complex geology that's led to, you know, Papua New Guinea hosting so many deposits. Basically, there's a whole series of them. Some household names like Oktedi, Freda River, Porphyry, and K92, of course. But then on the Indonesian side, you have Grasberg, which is the largest individual gold mine in the world. In terms of the geology, it's basically New Guinea is comprised of a whole series of stacked accretions, both that are island arc, and also you've got the bottom half, which is predominantly sediments that's been pushed up from the south, so at the junction of the Pacific and the Australian plates along this contact, and where K92 is right along that margin of this Papuan fold belt, which is where most of the deposits are hosted. So they're in there, and that Markham Ramu Valley is actually the demarcation point between the Australian Craton and the Pacific Plate, marked by this Finisterre range here. So in the east, it's actually truncated by the Auri Deformation Zone. So again, a really complex geology. And if we zoom into the actual district around Kainantu itself, you'll see that this particular area is mainly comprised of the Eastern Highlands and Morabie provinces. And within that area, you have more than 100 million ounces gold equivalent. So, you know, it's a really rich area. And within it, there are 2 operating gold mines, being Kainantu Gold Mine, obviously, and Hidden Valley, operated by Harmony Gold. But there are also several, or a few, very well-advanced, massive deposits in this area, including Waifi Goldbu, which I believe we'll see coming online before too long. And it also has the Bololo goldfields, which are in this area here, and that has a very long history of gold mining that goes right back more than 100 years. And in fact, Bololo, which is right in the middle of it, was the busiest airport in the world around early 1900s, just before World War I. So it's a very important area, this part of PNG. For K92, we have a very large package of land, nearly 850 square kilometres there, in what is arguably among the most prospective part of the country. The mining lease itself is right in the middle here, surrounded by 6 exploration licences. And within those licences, there are a whole number of epithermal and porphyry targets that have been identified and that we've identified as well. Some of these, or most of these, are historic, that were inherited from predecessors, Barrick and Highlands Pacific, who operated here. But in total, there's a combined 43-101 compliant resource of 16 million ounces thereabouts, of which more than 2 are in measured and indicated for the Kora mine. So we're gradually working our way through all of these prospects and deposits, and there's a whole series of more that I'll show at the end of this presentation. A little bit about the K92 mine itself. Like I mentioned, Highlands Pacific actually owned and operated the mine and started mining Irimafimpa deposit, which is well to the north of Kora, back in 2004. And then Barrick acquired the project, mainly for porphyry potential, and operated the mine for a couple of years around 2008. K92 came in 2014 and restarted the Irimafimpa mine in October 2016. And since then, it's been all happy days with a great production profile ramp up, with the mine expanding under massive expansion at the moment. So within a few years, or a couple of years in fact, we should be producing around 500,000 ounces of gold equivalent per annum. I won't dwell on this slide, but just one take-home message is that K92 has got a lot of money in the kitty to do exploration and to manage the mine expansion, obviously. There's a lot of institutional shareholders, and you'd think that they'd be pretty happy with the performance over the last few years. That trajectory is a little bit different. A little bit different now, just with the last couple of months where the market's gone a bit soft, but I'm sure we're going to see that come back. And as I said, it's a very high-grade mine, Kora. It's actually the 3rd highest grade underground asset for deposits which are over 5 million ounces of gold equivalent resource. So behind the Agnico Eagle, what was once Kirkland Lake deposits, Macassar and Fosterville. So really, a really important asset and a massive asset for Papua New Guinea, certainly a major taxpayer for Papua New Guinea. I just thought I'd show this slide mainly as a tribute actually to our late chairman, Tookie Angus, because I know a lot of you here actually knew Tookie really well. He passed away earlier this year and he was at the helm for, well, basically since the inception, 10 years ago. Myself, I joined in September 2016, just before the restart, so I'm one of the longest serving members of the management team. Just very briefly, before we move on to Blue Lake, just to recap on the Cora North discovery. For those of you who weren't here in 2019, basically we looked at the geological model for Cora and Irumafimpa and established that that the drill holes hadn't been drilled far enough towards Cora to actually determine any extension of it. So there was this huge gap in the middle here. This is the Irumafimpa deposit and the Cora deposit as it was known. But then there was this one hole of barracks that was down 950 odd metres that ended in mineralisation. So with that structural reinterpretation and otherwise, we figured we'd just put a longer hole or a series of holes right in the middle here. And bingo, we turned up what appeared to be Cora within just 300 metres of the main access incline. So that yielded 5.5 metres at 11.5 grams gold equivalent. So we knew we were onto something then. And things have really, really amped up since then. With the resource now, this is the latest one in December 2021, there's an upgrade that's imminent, but the resource is now well over 5.5 million ounces, as I mentioned. Now, there are two styles of mineralisation in Cora. You've got this one which is a very high-grade gold lode, and that's predominantly quartz vein breccia. This one here, quartz pyrite. Then there's a massive sulfide lode which is juxtaposed against that. So they're temporarily quite distinct, but right next to one another in space. And as you can see, it's a pretty nice looking rock. A lot of bornite and chalcopyrite predominating in that massive sulfide component. So a lot of really nice mineral specimens come from Cora. And finally, just to show you the mine in long section, we've basically been operating this out of the pre-existing, albeit refurbished, main access incline that Highlands, Pacific and Barrick actually put in place. That's this one here. But now we've got this twin incline, which is now past 2,700 metres of development. And once that's complete, which is, as you can see, very close now, that will enable us to be able to mine the Cora and Judd panels from the 800 metre level. So you've got, a huge ore body there ready to be stoped out using the Avoca style of stoping, which is ideal for these really steep high-grade lodes. And on the broader picture, if you look at a long section of Cora in relation to Irumafimpa, Cora here, we've got this big gap that we're filling through underground drilling and also surface drilling towards the A1 Porphyry target, which is a target that Barrick conceptualised and that we've just started drilling. So it's really exciting times on the exploration front near mine at K92. All right, finally, on to Blue Lake. So this is a very interesting story that stems back to around September 2017. And I happened to be walking with a couple of field technicians in one of the creeks, just looking for extensions of the Irumafimpa deposits, so the lodes which were mined previously. And these guys sort of came out of the jungle. One of them, this guy, Iran Araviso is his name. This fella, he happened to have a bag of rocks, slack handful of rocks, which he emptied out, all wrapped crudely in paper. And they're the rocks there. And as you can see, there's a variety of rock material that has some sort of resemblance to what you'd expect to see in a lithocap environment, and even possibly high sulfidation deposit. So I was very excited about this because often you see in PNG, guys and girls will come to you with polished marbles and stones and so forth, and it's hard to be discouraging, but usually it's just something that's been rolling around in the creek for a while or whatever. But in this case, I genuinely was excited. And when I inquired about it, this fellow Iron, he just said they came from Blue Lake up in the mountains. And at that time, having only been with the company a short time, I hadn't even known about Blue Lake because it's hidden right up in the mountains at about 1,800 metres elevation. So it's in a hidden valley, so to speak. So eventually, when I sort of did a bit more inquiring and looking at Google Earth and everything else that you do, we got up there, and the locals were very accommodating, and we were just flabbergasted to see, the style of mineralisation or at least the alteration that abounded there. I mean, this whole mountain at Blue Lake or surrounding Blue Lake was just completely altered, and with localised enegite in breccias, a lot of this sort of thing where you have really dark enegite as a breccia matrix to massively silicified dacite clasts, as well as these shingle type breccias also with leached dacite clasts and porphyry infill, and then other sheeter type veining with dickite, massive dickite alteration and disseminated pyrite. So it was very akin to what I'd seen at Golpu some years before, having worked there for a few years. So I was pretty excited about all this. And then when you look at Blue Lake, if you actually look at an image of Blue Lake viewed towards the south, actually the south-southwest here, what you'll see is these areas where the enegite actually outcrop are in this area here. And they were exposed by a fairly recent earthquake that was only a year or two before actually I got up into this area. So that was it just happened to be, coincidence that was the case, to actually have these recent exposures that the predecessor companies would never have had access to. So we started thinking about this in a conceptual way, and I pulled up an even earlier model of dixilitose compared to what Dave pulled up this morning, one that dates right back to more than 20 years ago, a very basic one, but fundamentally very sound and certainly applicable, where you have a lithocap type environment, silica cap forming above a porphyry, which is then later intruded by high sulfidation fluids emanating from the porphyry. And when you actually superimpose those outlines, those exact outlines, onto that same image I just showed you, you see that here's the high sulfidation area, happens to just reside. I mean, I have to admit, I did play around with the aspect to get it all to sort of fit here, but I didn't play around with those outlines. And then it's sitting, this whole ridge here is this massive silica cum alunite and porphyry. And even dixilitose's outline of this actual diatreme pipe happens to coincide with Blue Lake itself. So we interpret this, without having swum to the bottom of it and collected samples, we interpret this as some sort of vent feature. So every aspect of that very simple model of Dix actually happens to coincide with what we see at Blue Lake. Of course, at that time, we had no idea about the porphyry itself. We only had this outline, but we figured that was a good place to start looking for it. And also, just using an analogy, the Wafi Golpu analogy, these two photos, these two images, one, like I mentioned, the Blue Lake one at the top there, that's viewed to the south-southwest, whereas the one below is of the Wafi mountain, viewed in the opposite direction, north-northeast. And, you know, if you've got an open mind, you can see some similarities there in that you've got this very strongly leached lithocap environment. Similar sort of geomorphology here. But really importantly are these major arc transfer structures that truncate, this zone of massive advanced argillic alteration. So all of these things, compounded to get us pretty excited about Blue Lake. So we set up the typical Taj Mahal made out of bush materials and tarps and visqueen up there in the jungle, up there in the bush, and got to work initially with an extensive soil program based on a 50 by 50 metre grid, and assessed that for the usual 48 elements. Here shown gold and copper, but interestingly, that zone in the middle where it's a little bit depauperate happens to coincide with like the centre of the system where a lot of the high sulphidation type fluid or type alteration is apparent. So it seems to have actually overprinted earlier prograde mineralisation there. But in all, we ended up with quite a substantial anomaly that was around 1.3 kilometres by 0.8 kilometres in dimension. So while we were undertaking the soil program, we commenced quite a lot of trenching as well. And we soon realised that the entire mountain was basically just this leached, bleached, massive silica, massive Uggies type silica, but with pyrophyllite and locally with alunite infill. So we realised, that this is a substantial system and that it wasn't all just float material that we were looking at surface. It genuinely was an extremely expansive zone. And of course, that made it a little bit tricky as to where to target, based on what Dave was saying earlier today, and Dave as well on Onto with regards to these lithocaps as being extremely extensive. Where do you go? So we really, we mapped the whole area out, and we found there were a whole series of different felsic rocks, including various breccias and in particular fractured dacite domes. So it was quite an ideal situation for high sulphidation style of mineralisation, which is what we actually initially, just quietly, thought it might be based on all this enegite in the silicified material. It seemed to be that was the target. So after mapping all this, we put a fence of holes right the way through. We soon worked out that the main trend through the area was the north-northeast, which replicates what you see throughout much of Papua New Guinea, that transfer trend. And we put a fence of holes at 200 metres spacing right the way across that. And what we were actually looking for with that, we drilled these holes down to around 450 metres average depth, and we were looking for vectors towards higher temperature alteration, mineralisation ideally, and to get through the lithocap into the green rock environment. And so we were successful in being able to do that. And in fact, the very first hole, this one here, returned 175 metres at around 0.3 gold and 0.2 copper. So, and that actually ended up being the best hole actually in that set of that set of 6 holes on that fence. There's actually one hidden behind here in case you think there's more than 5 there. So anyway, then after that, first of all, before we started more drilling, another phase of drilling, we actually model all of this up geologically, and we were able to determine that there's a similar sort of thing we saw at surface was replicated at depth, where you had very steep, almost vertical dacites and associated breccias with quite a lot of alunite feeders in it. So the conceptual porphyry was born beneath this area where all of this, intrusive complex was potentially stemming from. Then we ran spectral data we ran the spectroscopy, the ASD, across all of the core samples, and we were able to generate a model of the main mineralisation, or the main alteration minerals, should I say. And that showed definitely that there was a layered lithocap. As you can see here, very, very obvious layered lithocap. But then that transitioned into more of a white mica environment, where you've got your paragonite, paragonite, muscovite, that sort of thing. But then in some of the deeper holes, we were able to actually identify some pseudomorphs of potassic minerals. So all of these features were starting to, coincidentally point to this target at depth, sort of in this area here. And just while we were drilling that, we first had to get through the lithocap, as I mentioned. And there were some tantalising signs of high sulfidation minerality in some places, like with some enegite in fracture film, this sort of thing, quite a lot of that. But was predominantly just massive silica throughout. So it was pretty hard to actually identify, which part, where the hot spot was. Fortunately, as I say, we managed to get through that lithocap out of the white rock and into the green, where we came into this more grey-green type of assemblage, which was predominated by a whole series of different white micas. Some of those ones I mentioned before, many that I really struggle with, but to identify, with a hand lens, you've really got to put that beam on it to actually see what sort of clay you're dealing with and this sort of thing. And of course, in the deeper parts of the holes, of some of the holes, we came across mineralisation, which was really encouraging. A lot of good textures, a lot of different vein styles, including a lot of associated magnetite with those veins. But at this stage, most of the veins were B veins, so quartz centerline veins, centrally terminated veins with chalcopyrite centres, and very broad sericite selvages to the veins. But quite a decent vein density, in the deeper parts of these holes. So again, everything was, sort of pointing towards something at depth here. And also the presence of these shingle breccias was really encouraging, potentially representing like the roof ceiling of some sort of collapse feature. So yeah, all of these things very alluring. And in some cases we had like half a dozen different sulfide species all in one. So you can see the phylogenetic sequence in that, from pyrite through covellite, etc., enegite. So with all this information, just from that first fence of drill holes, we modelled this up in Serpac, because at the time we were basically just using Serpac for all of the work on the mine site. These guys, they die hard, they don't want to give up Serpac, so exploration also used that. And this was quite useful in putting together all of the structures, modelling those and projecting the structures to depth to see, where might be the best place to actually do the follow-up drill campaign, the next drill phase. And obviously we had to put in a conceptual potassic altered porphyry here, which is, in the same position I showed you on the sections before. Then we went about the next phase of drilling, which was more or less the same as the first phase, in that it was 200 metre spacing, a long section, but then we did 200 metre sections along strike as well. So a cross strike and a long strike, we drilled this out at 200 metre spacing, but in much the same manner that we did the first drill out, the first drill phase, in that we were very disciplined in only drilling to a certain depth, so that we couldn't, we basically had that sort of methodology that we'd try and sneak up on this thing rather than frighten it off with a deep drill hole, or frighten the board off at least. So we stuck to that strategy, drilling all of these holes down to around 500 metres depth, and many of those ended in mineralisation. But that then set up a cause for the next phase, which was going to be deeper targeted drilling. So at around about that time, managed to convince the boss, the CEO, to invest in Leapfrog. So that made everything much easier. You just push a button and let it do the work. So in this case, we're able to use the same modelling strategy, or the same data at least, should I say. And that, just with the, the grade modelling, it actually defined a very well concentrically zoned deposit here, which was open very much at depth. And a lot of the holes didn't intersect mineralisation, and that's in this very thick lithocap. But the lithocap is preferentially on one side of the porphyry, and the porphyry itself obviously has a very strong tilt to it, so it's quite reminiscent in that regard to Golpu. But this is even more tilted over. And a few of these deeper holes came back with, we started doing the deeper targeting at that point, once we sort of knew where the centre of this was. One of these holes came back 200 metres at 0.5 gold and 0.28 copper. So this appeared to be, more towards the core of the system. And that's what we were obviously targeting, is the potassic core in this situation, and to try and be not influenced by all the different overprints, because for the most part they seem to have been fairly detrimental to the actual pro-grade or higher grade material. And just looking at the porphyry, after we drilled a whole series of these holes, a total of 26 holes for 16,500 metres, we're able to see for sure that, it is a concentrically zoned porphyry, and it has this much higher grade core, above 0.8 grams gold equivalent in the centre, and then it's open at depth. So we deliberately drilled this down to a certain depth so that we could, leave plenty of upside. You've got to do that. And also to be able to drill this section, and it's going to entail quite a few deep holes. So this is something that we've actually parked, just for the moment, and you'll see why shortly, because we just have so many other things that we're doing at K92. But this is an example of some of the core from that potassic zone. It's actually now, or has been, overprinted by a phyllic, a strong sericite overprint, but you can see just the proliferation of different veins in there. And just looking at the veins in a little bit more detail, you'll see that there are, a whole series of different vein phases. And interestingly, in some of the deeper holes, you have these wormy A-type veins, which have then been overprinted by your classic B-type centrally terminated veins. But then also you have the C-type, if that's the updated terminology for these things, the chalcopyrite-only veins. Fraser knows all about this. But anyway, you can see there's been a lot happening in the Blue Lake Porphyry in terms of different overprints. And talking overprints, some of the phyllic overprint, the sericite, where it's overprinted the potassic, it's literally just denuded the veins of all sulfides. So you're just left with these veins that are just completely hollowed out, and you've just got a vuggy centre basically. They're quite fascinating looking, but you can see there's been a lot of acidic fluid that's gone through them to render them that way. Also, we have a lot of anhydrite, particularly as a breccia infill. There's quite a few localised breccias within the Blue Lake Porphyry, so anhydrite's a pretty major constituent. And also in the centre, a lot of bornite and, of course, magnetite. So it really does fit into Dave's category of the highly oxidised anhydrous, I'd imagine, just looking at the actual host rock, type of porphyry. Talking overprints, we've got this high sulfidation overprint, which is localised, but it's very evident in the petrology when you're looking at the tennantite and anagite and so forth. It actually overprints the hypogene primary minerals, bornite and chalcopyrite and so forth. Also looked at Blue Lake briefly with using iGas software, and that really clearly demonstrates this upper part where you have your advanced hydraulic zone in blue, the sericite, the grey-green zone in red, and the potassic zone in maroon, and also for alunite showing up in the upper parts, but particularly anhydrite. And this anhydrite distribution more or less mimics the actual distribution of the porphyry itself. And plotting all this data from Blue Lake on one of Scott Haley's charts, it does appear that certainly the mineralised porphyries at Blue Lake here all plot within his porphyry copper prospective copper field. So that's really encouraging. But then, of course, there are a whole series of other intrusive types which actually overprint this, including a lot of different dikes. So the proliferation of dikes is really encouraging, except that it stopes out the mineralisation. And we had Dick Stillito come over and have a look at Blue Lake just last year after we'd done a resource on it. But he was able to identify quite a number of intermineral porphyries right in the centre of it, which is also unfortunate because that stopes out the earlier higher grade mineralisation. How much I hate those things. They're just in every deposit, it seems. We also, before we formed the model, we generated shells for the main lithological types, alteration styles, and also the quartz stockwork vein density. And so this early intrusive diorite phase, tonalite, should I say, corresponded well with the potassic zone, which comprises mostly biotite and K-spar, and that also corresponds with the zone above 5% quartz stockwork veining density, or percentage, should I say. So in terms of resource, we, like I say, we drilled 26 holes for 16,500 metres and ended up with 10.8 million ounces gold equivalent at 0.61 grams gold equivalent. So not the highest grade deposit in the world, but certainly a lot of contained ounces and certainly done very cheaply. We're able to drill this out over just 3 years, and that includes 1 full year in 2020 where we were restricted from actually getting to the site because of COVID-related restrictions, stopping inter-province travel and that sort of thing in Papua New Guinea. So that was, fortunate to do that and to be able to prove this up at the cost of only $1 per ounce effectively. And so the block model was composited at 2 metre composites, and there's just a few different slices through it, all done on ordinary kriging, showing this real tilt to the porphyry, and on the margins, definitely a lot of area where there's this sericite, the blind shoulder, which is devoid of grade, basically. All right, and looking at Blue Lake in the scheme of things in relation to the mine, K92 mine, this is EL470, one of our main licenses, where you have the Cora deposit in here, Cora and Judd, and Blue Lake sits here. A1 is where we'll just commence work. But this conductivity slice, real-time conductivity, was taken just a couple of years ago using mobile MT. So it's got a much greater frequency range than the Z10, and therefore your depth penetration is much greater, down to around 1,500 metres depth. So that actually shows, this conductive zone through here, where you've got a lot of sulphide and clay, and it also points to Blue Lake, but it suggests that Blue Lake, we've definitely got some legs in Blue Lake towards the south, which is the way it plunges. A1 is what we're particularly interested in, right at the confluence of these major corridors, and as you can see, there's a lot of porphyries and veins in this area. A1 was always very popular with Barrick due to its structural setting that I just showed, and also the presence of a lot of really good-looking rocks such as enegite, and obviously exotic copper. A1 that we've started on now, there's a very large copper anomaly there, above 500, spanning more than a couple of kilometres in strike length and nearly a kilometre across. And the same thing for another porphyry that we've been working on, just doing blanket geochem at 50 by 50 metres spacing, that's also defined a very large system of similar dimensions at the historic Yartree prospect, which has never been drilled, but it's been in the literature for about 3 decades or so. So to conclude on Blue Lake, I mean, it's a clean, nicely concentrically zoned porphyry. So it's sort of textbook in that regard. It's got the maiden hole, in fact, actually intersected the porphyry itself, retaining that intercept I mentioned. Most of the grade is focused within the potassic zone in the core, which is still very much open at depth. And this is a novel discovery that had no work done previously in that area. And fortunately, the local landowners there are all embracing, so they're really keen to see another phase of work. As I mentioned, the reason why we've actually parked Blue Lake for the time being is that there are just so many prospects, targets and deposits in the K92 tenement package that it's really hard to get bogged down in something that's not going to deliver something in the near term. So we've got a lot that we're working on, gradually pushing these up across in terms of prospectivity and up in terms of data knowledge into the red with a couple in production, and also a couple of historic resources that we're working on now. But there are several others, many of which we can explore from the underground workings in existing infrastructure that surrounds the mine. So I guess the key learnings from all of this work that we've done at Blue Lake, well, there are several really. I mean, when there's earthquakes, you should get out there, and as long as it's done safely, get out there and have a look at the exposures. Dave Cook actually suggested to me a year or so ago, get a drone out, and that's probably a safer bet, because some of these landslips, they form on, minus 80 degree slopes, and boulders are just coming down all the time. So it's a pretty hazardous place to be hitting rocks and not having your wits about you. I think another key learning is never turn down a bag of rocks, because you just never know what's going to be in that. And I think you've just got to have an open mind as to this normalising with the host rocks, because depending on what you're after, and this goes back to what Dave was saying earlier, we could see quite clearly in the onset that all the host rocks were felsics, porous, granodiorite, etc., as well as the later stage intrusives. And therefore the footprint was huge, owing to this permeability and the extensive alteration. And therefore the grades, you're going to have a sort of a cap there potentially, unless you've got some sort of preeminent silicification that's trapped the fluids. Whereas at Golpu, literally 100 kilometres away, all hosted within sediments, it's much tighter, and therefore, more like a pencil porphyry with higher grade. So I think that's something you've got to bear in mind. Also, I admit to quite an expensive mistake when drilling this, going too early, and that was to drill underneath that hole 18, which returned the 200-metre intercept at a gram gold equivalent. And that was to drill directly beneath that. But because the porphyry is tilted, it drilled underneath it and didn't really turn up much at all. So we had to really rethink the model at that point, and always look at that hole with, a little bit of shame. But anyway, that's the way it goes. What other learnings are there? There's the usual sort of stuff: communicate well with the board and keep the faith. And keep moving too. Prospect turnover is so important, because there are just so many projects in these tenements. You've just got to really evaluate everything and really determine their value before you commit to too much. And on that note, I'd like to say thanks very much Taso.
Any questions for Chris? I've got one, Chris. When were you last here? 2 years ago, was it? 3?
4, yeah.
So you're going to be back in...
2019.
Do you think you'll be back in 2 years' time with another one?
I'd like to think so with A1, yeah.
Yeah. And then the other one is, what's the highest gold grade you see in Blue Lake?
Highest gold grades are around about, we've had like 1.5.
Right.
That sort of thing, right in the middle, around sort of 30 metres at 1.5. But
Okay.
that's just right in the potassic zone,
Yep.
where it's mostly bornite mineralisation. So, yeah, we only snagged that right in the core, which is where the drilling sort of terminates, but it starts to get expensive following that axis down.
All right. Okay, thanks, Chris. All right, I'd
you.
like to thank both speakers, and lunch will now be served out in the exhibition area, and it's sponsored today by De Grey Mining. And session 7 will commence at 1 p.m, so thank you.